Welcome, everybody. I see there's still a few people coming in. Please seat yourselves and we'll get started. My name is Toby Dershowitz. I'm Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Strategy at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We meet in the midst of one of the bloodiest stretches of the Syrian war, where more than 500,000 people have been killed, including more than 120 children among the 500 civilians or so who have been killed just in the last 2 weeks or so. Chemical weapons against the Syrian population have reportedly been used 7 times in 2018 and 197 times since 2011. Syrian warplanes have been systematically destroying medical facilities. Aid convoys themselves are having a difficult time getting through and are themselves in danger. Children are looking through rubble, not just to find blankets, but to find signs of life. Syria may have been knocked off the headlines, but the brutality continues, whether or not we are watching or not, whether or not we're acting. Now, most analysts say that Syria would not have been able to carry out its 8-year war without the backing of Iran propping up the Assad regime with funding, with military equipment, and indeed with Iranian-backed militias on the ground. And that's the topic of our conversation today. What role is Iran playing in Syria? Beyond Hezbollah, who are these militias that should be household names for us, just like Hezbollah is? What are the serious concerns they present to our national security interests, and how should we address those concerns in our national security strategy? What about Iran and the IRGC's larger presence in Syria? What are the implications for U.S. national security interests in the region? What actions will we take to address those national security interests? Just a note briefly about FDD for our audience here in the nation's capital and for those watching us on live stream. FDD is a nonpartisan think tank conducting research on the key national security issues of our day. We're so pleased to be able to work so closely with members of Congress, with so many people in the administration, the defense and intelligence community, the diplomatic corps, and certainly the media, all of whom are represented here today. My congressional relations colleagues, Boris Silberman and Tyler Stapleton, are here as well, and we are all happy to answer questions for you after the event, or, of course, any member of the FDD staff. Before we start with the panel discussion, before I turn, Josh, the mic over to you, Josh Rogan, our moderator, one of the most thoughtful national security journalists in Washington, I'm very pleased to welcome Congressman Adam Kinzinger to give opening remarks. As many of you know, the Congressman is a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and has been outspoken on Syria, keeping both the Syrian people at the center of the conversation and U.S. national security interests on this most bipartisan discussion. Representative Kinzinger has served in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and he continues to serve our country as a major in the Air National Guard and has received many well-deserved awards for his heroism. We thank you for your service, Congressman, and for your leadership, and we warmly welcome you to our stage today. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to do something that always drives my staff nuts, which is, they prepare all these remarks for me, and then I basically loosely follow them, but then just kind of talk, and they're like, why did we do all that work? But that's what I'm going to do. I want to talk just about what's going on to kind of set the table a little bit, give you some of my thoughts and concerns, and then you have way smarter people than me that are going to talk about this, and it's good to see. I know most of you up on the panel, and I'll tell you these are the experts on, what's going on. Let me just first off say I want to kind of paint a picture of what is America's role and what is our mission in the world. And a lot of the times I think really it's been a long time since anybody has articulated what's the purpose of America? What's the mission? What's the national world mission of America beyond just, we need to protect shipping lanes and things like that? What is it that we actually are going for? And so for those of you that aren't American in this room, sometimes you may wonder, what is it that drives us to do what we do? Because theoretically, we could bring everybody home from everywhere overseas. We could put up the walls here, and we'd have a pretty fine existence because nobody would invade us. We love our friends Canada, but even if they got mad at us, they wouldn't try it. So what is it that drives us and compels us? And I actually think if you look at what is America's mission in the world, and ever since our inception, it's a country that, if you were an alien from outer space and you came down and somebody described all the different nations of the world to you, this would be the country that you thought there's no chance it would ever actually work. If you said, look, there's going to be people from different religions, people from different ethnic backgrounds, people from different races, it's going to have these different challenges, you're going to look and go, well, that country is going to be pretty screwed up. But it's actually in our ability to have come together from so many different backgrounds, build our own constitution, fight a civil war to defend the federal government, go to World War I only to try to isolate again, to be pulled into World War II and realize that we have a unique mission to play in this world. I think our mission is pretty simple. It's to be an example of self-governance to billions of people outside our shores that don't have what we have but are desperate for a taste of it. And I could go into a whole list of reasons why and all the places I've been where people, would just kind of look to the United States to provide an example of what they can compel or strive to. But when you look at the Middle East specifically, it's, one of the things we fight here at home as politicians is people that just basically say it was because you invaded Iraq that the Arab Spring happened and everything's a mess. I disagree with that being the cause. But they say, look, just bring everybody home, let the Middle East burn, whatever. That's the kind of things we have to fight here. But if you look at it, what are the values that have compelled us? And it's not just protecting the shipping lanes. It's not just our economic benefit and everything else. It's the fact that we fight, the United States fights for a cause bigger than ourselves every time. Even if it's a war, for instance, that we've been in, or a military conflict that really only has a direct economic impact, we do it because, to us, it's about value of people. So let's look at Syria. Why is Syria such a tragedy? My heart breaks when I hear Bill Clinton say his biggest regret was inaction in Rwanda. I didn't vote for President Obama, but I believe President Obama is a good man. I think the Obama administration will be haunted the rest of their lives with inaction in Syria, specifically in 2013. It was a moment in which the United States could have taken a stand. The Syrian parliament basically had left the country. It was time. We were stepping up. Assad was going to go in this process, and it would have been probably a messy transition afterwards, but it got worse and worse ever since. And I think that's going to be something that haunts the last administration, and I don't cheer that. I think that's not something that you want to live with. But if you look at where we are today, if you look in Syria specifically, it was really since the nuclear deal, and I think this is the big thing to keep in mind. There was a point which the nuclear deal became everything about the Iran issue. So when we talked about Iran, it was always in the context of the nuclear deal. And if we get a nuclear deal, then we're going to fix the problem. Well, the nuclear issue is just a small part of the bigger issue of Iran. Why are we concerned about Iran having nuclear weapons? Because we see their stabilizing behavior in the region. We see their decision or their funding of bad groups. We see that they work with bad nation-state actors in order to develop their mass weapons, their weapons of mass destruction. So we get a nuclear deal and release a lot of money to Iran. And in that process, they have spun up their Iranian militias. Now, if you look all over the region, I think there's some estimates that up to 80% of Assad's fighters are actually provided by Shia militias. And that is actually what is keeping him in power, as well as the Russian mercenaries and Russian military, as we've seen. If you look in Iraq specifically, look, I was part of a task force that not just went after al-Qaeda in Iraq, but also went after Shia militias, Iranian militias in Iraq. And I can tell you they are responsible, in some estimates, of up to 1/4 of American military deaths in the Iraq war. And this is why I have a bill with my colleague, how do you say his last name, Zach? Swazi. I always call him Swazili. It's Swazi. But we have a bill to actually sanction bad actors in Iraq, working on behalf of the Iranians. This is the kind of strong mission that America can make, and strong statement. But I think in going forward, it's important to just be aware of actually what's going on. And as I was introduced, it was mentioned that this has come off of the headlines lately. And up until you have a chemical weapons attack like we saw recently, and 60 Minutes picks it up, people tend to forget what's going on in Syria. And I think it's essential for us to keep reminding people of exactly what is happening, of the fact that these militias in Syria are propping up an evil man that's killed 500,000 people, including 50,000 children. That number's probably climbed by now. If you look at the fact that in Iraq, it's a very complicated situation in Iraq, we get that, but the Shia militias backed by the Iranian government are continuing to try to destabilize that region and bring Iraq under the hegemony of Iran. So it is essential for us to push back, and we can push back in multiple ways. Now, I've met with the administration in terms of Iran, and I can tell you, I feel a lot more comfort that this administration has an idea of what's going on in Iran and is willing to push back harder than the last administration did. Does that mean they're doing everything I want? Nope. But I think it's a clear-eyed understanding of what's going on. Targeted sanctions against the IRGC. I think calling out their bad behavior worldwide. In proxy wars they want, having folks fight back against them. So supporting our folks in Syria who are doing good work against the Shia-backed militias in Syria that are obviously backing up Bashar al-Assad and his evil regime. I think making it clear, if you cross the Euphrates River in an attempt to take an oil field from the United States, we're going to kill hundreds of you, and we're going to do it in a matter of about an hour. And that happened a few weeks ago with the Russian mercenaries that crossed, and we know that. So, look, I think it's exposing what's going on, and I think also this. It is a very difficult situation for us to go in and solve in Syria specifically. I think in 2013 was the perfect time for U.S. and allied intervention to make a change there. But today it's very complicated. I think it's actually at great risk of escalating more than I've ever seen before. You have basically great powers all resting in Syria right now and where they are. But I think when it's the use of chemical weapons, look, we don't have to get involved in deciding the future of Syria to destroy Assad's air force and his ability to use chemical weapons against his own people. I don't think you have to get involved in the civil war in Syria to make it clear that the use of chemical weapons is going to have a far outsized cost than any benefit you can gain from that. And I would actually encourage the Trump administration to destroy and ground Assad's both anti-air system and his air force and anything he uses to deliver weapons of mass destruction. We have to continue to hold that red line in this world for the future sake of our country. And I think it's also continuing to support our allies and push back against Iranian militias. And continue to sanction Iran, not because of their use of, because of their development of nuclear weapons. Sure, there's a agreement in place right now, but because of their destabilizing behavior in the region. And we need to make that cost excessive as well. And we need to unite our allies. We have a lot of allies in the region that are wanting to get involved, but they want American leadership to lead the way because it's something that only we uniquely can do. And it is time for us to step up and uniquely do that again. Nobody's asking for 200,000 American troops to occupy Syria, but people are asking for American leadership because it comes with something very unique, and that is the ability to rally the forces of good to fight against the forces of evil. So you guys are going to be hearing from some way smarter than me people today, and I appreciate all their service and all their advocacy on behalf of the innocent people of Syria that are finding themselves being killed. I want to say one last thing, though. If anybody tells you, because this is kind of it's the Russian line, it's the line of kind of some of the extremists in our country. If somebody tells you that dictatorships work and that we need to go back to supporting strong men in countries because back in the day, at least it kept order, that's somebody that doesn't understand anything about foreign policy and humanity. And I say that humbly. I don't ever take cheap shots at people. But in the era of smartphones, and in the era of media, and in the era of Twitter and Facebook, and the ability to communicate and talk to your friends, you can now rally against a dictator from hundreds of miles away. You don't need to meet in a room in the fear that there may be a secret agent in there that has you all and your family killed. Humanity does not like to be oppressed. Humanity will not be oppressed. And so if we believe we can go back to 1980s dictatorships and somehow have peace in the Middle East, we are completely and utterly wrong. People have to go through determining their own future, and it is a messy process. It was messy for us. But ultimately, people have the right to determine their own destiny because they're going to demand it. So thank you all for being out here. God bless you. And let's hope we get some real peace in Syria and Bashar al-Assad gets to meet his maker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Kinzinger. I'm Josh Rogan. I'm with the Washington Post. I'm going to be leading our discussion today. Is it true, Congressman, that today is your 40th birthday?
Yesterday was.
Oh, yesterday. Well, happy birthday. Is that why you took the aviators off? You know, I first met Congressman Kinzinger on a congressional delegation with John McCain to the Munich Security Conference. And for the whole trip, Senator McCain introduced him as Henry Kissinger's grandson. McCain was joking. Nobody else knew he was joking. So what we're going to do here today is I'm going to open up the discussion by posing a question to each of our distinguished panelists. Then I'm going to have a couple of questions of my own, and then we'll turn it over to you as soon as we can. We're going to all assume that in this room, you guys are policy professionals, have a level of knowledge. So we're going to try to elevate this discussion to focus on practical things that Congress can do, perhaps even in a bipartisan manner. Let me introduce our panelists. Of course, we have Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who has too many titles to list all at once, but right now he's the visiting lecturer and diplomat in residence at Princeton University and former U.S. ambassador to a half a dozen countries, including Iraq and Syria. Next, we have Melissa Dalton, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She recently returned from Syria with General Votel, so we're going to definitely hear from her on that. Next, we have Muaz Mustafa, Executive Director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, one of his many titles, also the man behind, one of the men and women behind the Caesar Bill, which the Congress passed twice to sanction Assad, Russia, and Iran for atrocities in Syria. And last, but of course not least, Dr. David Adesnik, the Director of Research at FDD and former Policy Director of the Edmund McMullen Campaign for President. So let me start with Ambassador Crocker, and let me build off of what Congressman Kinzinger said and ask you the question that he asked us. What is America's role? What are we doing? What can we do? What should we be doing? I don't want to give you any more direction than that.
Well, let me frame it broadly. We are at the kind of the century mark for the modern Middle East. Those lines on the map were drawn during the First World War and consecrated in Versailles in 1919. And so it's a moment to look back as well as forward. You know, what happened at Versailles relevant to the U.S.? Well, we basically got shouldered out of the room by the Brits and the French. Wilson did establish the King Crane Commission to go out into the Middle East and recommend what next after the Ottoman era. They did. They actually polled people who lived there, a radical step at the time. The answer they got back was, of course, they'd like to be independent. They knew that wasn't in the offing. Their second choice was for a unitary mandate managed by the United States. The recommendation of King Crane was for that, for a fixed period in time, for a single purpose, to prepare the peoples of that region for self-governance. That is exactly what did not happen. So what we saw was a succession of isms in the region: colonialism, imperialism to kick it off, monarchism in some of the core countries like Iraq and Egypt, straight-out autocracies, Qasem in Iraq in '58, for example. And on it went, through Arab socialism, communism in South Yemen, kind of everything except democracy in the Arab regions. None of them worked. Now we're watching Islamism fold its tent, at least as an overt movement. They're not going away. I'm here to tell you, we tried to get rid of Al-Qaeda in Iraq when I was there. We couldn't do it. These guys are just going to make themselves a little harder to find. So Islamism fails. Now what? Well, some other ism is putting itself together somewhere out there. I don't know what it is. I know it's not going to be good, because the quintessential problem of that region, it's a failure of governance. None of those isms could govern. None of them could provide security, services, economic opportunity for their peoples. And that I'm here to tell you, is not coming to a theater near you anytime soon at all, unless or until that is cracked. Anything we may do or others might do just isn't going to get a lot of traction. So I hope I haven't been too irrationally exuberant here. I could.
Oh, that's a good place to start. Well, let me just press you a little bit further. Given all of that reality in Syria, what is the United States government's role, or what should it be?
Well, yes, I would agree with Congressman Kinzinger. I think we did have a moment, not just in 2013, but I think from 2011 up to 2013. What happened in Syria was probably pretty predictable, and how the Syrians responded to it, and how the Iranians responded to it. I mean, I was there for a lot of that. I was there for the 40th day commemoration of Hafiz al-Assad's death. The guest of honor was Hassan Nasrallah, very visibly so, with a number of his gunmen. So Bashar, from the get-go, had a much tighter relationship with Hezbollah, and through them with Iran, than his father did. So you could see that coming. You could also see the explosion coming. It took a long time for the fuse that was lit in Hama in February of 1982 to actually detonate. Most folks here have never heard of Hama. No Syrian will ever forget it. When Assad and his brother Rifat cornered the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood in Syria's fourth largest city, reduced it to rubble, pretty well got rid of the Muslim Brothers, but also got rid of somewhere north of 20,000 Sunni civilians. So they knew payback might come, and when it did, they had worked for 3 decades, father and son, to build the perfect police state. So for those of us who served out there, or those of you who have the unique opportunity to live next door to it, it wasn't a surprise that it was going to be a little different, that Assad wasn't like Mubarak or Gaddafi or Ben Ali. They were ready for it. So when our president said Assad must go, I thought, oh, dear God, having now said that, how precisely you're going to do it. It's foreign policy 101. Be sure you got the means to back up your policies before you announce them. I guess they happily thought that we would say it and he would go. So where does it go now? Well, I'll tell you one place I don't want to see it go. Secretary Tillerson's comments that we were going to keep the forces we have there to be a check on the Iranians, their clients, the Assad regime, and the Russian backers. We're all marked by our experiences. Somebody should ask Tim Garrity and Larry Gerlach what they would think of that. Tim Garrity commanded 24 Mao. Larry Gerlach was the battalion commander. I was there October 23, 1983. The Marine barracks blows up. Brought to you by precisely those same actors that we are now going to check in Syria, Iran and the Syrian regime. So we tend to forget these things did not go well for us. So I don't know what the answers are. That would not be one.
Got it. Thank you. Let me take it from where you just left off, because I think it touches upon what former Ambassador of Syria Robert Ford wrote in The Atlantic yesterday, which is that our current military posture in Syria is one way or the other untenable. What he said was, America's adversaries will learn how better to attack U.S. forces and allies. With time, U.S. personnel will face a greater risk, while the deepening morass will demand either concession or escalation. So it seems like you guys are on the same page about that. So I want to turn that over to Melissa. And we're going to talk about the Shiite militias. We're going to get to that in the next round. But for now, you were on the ground with General Votel. I read the coverage. He said, military can do some things, but they can't do everything. The region needs help urgently. He was saying it very, very clearly. Yesterday at the House Armed Services Committee, he went even further. He said that the Kurdish forces fighting the Turks is drawing them away from finishing the fight against ISIS. And he said that Russia is playing the role of both the arsonist and the fireman, fueling tensions and then trying to resolve them in their favor. What did you see on the ground? How would you build upon what Ambassador Crocker just said about our military presence and strategy or lack thereof?
Thanks for the opportunity to join the distinguished panel today, and I'm delighted to join the conversation. I did have an opportunity to travel with General Votel as part of a delegation to visit Raqqa, Syria, following the clearing operations that were concluded in December. And it's quite clear that there's a monumental task ahead. The primary purpose of those U.S. forces that are still in Syria is, of course, to conclude that counter-ISIS campaign as they chase ISIS down the middle Euphrates River Valley. There are still some hardened cells of ISIS around the Deir ez-Zor province area that we're working very closely with our SDF partners to roll up. But now the campaign largely is shifting to a stabilization mission, and General Votel's comments are really well put in terms of emphasizing the importance of other tools of statecraft that are going to be vital to leverage to consolidate the security gains that U.S. forces have hard won with Syrian partners in northern and now eastern Syria, and the importance of the international community supporting that effort, not just the United States, to assist with the rubble clearing, the demining that is so vital to take place in Raqqa. When ISIS left Raqqa, it completely booby-trapped the place, placing mines in baby formula, in people's ovens, in civilian homes, such that making the place quite untenable for any follow-on governance that might attempt to emerge there. And I think governance being the key linchpin, whether it's in the stabilization focus for the United States and its Syrian partners in eastern and northern Syria going forward, and how you manage that given tensions, perennial tensions between the Arabs and the Kurds, as we had the Afrin operation going on during our visit, but then also how that U.S. presence and the stabilization focus creates some form of leverage from what has traditionally been Syria's periphery into the center of gravity, the center of Syria that is held by Assad and backed up by Russia and Iran and their militias and mercenaries, where there is also poor governance. And I think fundamentally the drivers of this conflict have come down to poor governance. Assad's poor governance of Syria, the expression of ISIS as an attempt of another form of governance, but that was also insufficient and poor. And what is the answer to addressing Sunni grievances in the broader Syria-Iraq dimension that is being exploited by Iran, by Russia, and other predatory forms of governance?
Great. I want to ask more about Syrian Sunni grievances in a second, but before that, let me just follow up very quickly. There were reports while you were there that the Assad regime was coming to the aid of the Kurdish forces when the U.S. Government wasn't willing to do so. Is that true? And what do you think that means? And how scared should we be about the Kurds just striking a deal with the regime and cutting us out?
I have seen those reports, and I think war creates incentives for different parties to try to pragmatically address their interests. So when it comes to the counter-ISIS mission, the partnership between the United States and the SDF has been quite clear. As that is starting to wind down and we are shifting into more questions of stabilization, post-conflict reconstruction, and how we begin to put Humpty Dumpty back together again in Syria, it's raising these questions of how viable partnerships and alliances are going to be in this new environment, and putting pressure on some of the existing partnerships. So I could see future instances of pragmatic interests driving certain parties that perhaps haven't been aligned in the past together in order to address what they view as a more viable pathway forward to address their interests.
Is there any appetite inside the military for perhaps encouraging the YPG or the SDF or whatever you want to call it to reintegrate back into the Syrian government system?
I think there's a clear-eyed recognition that the Assad model of governance is not tenable for the future stability of Syria, but big questions about what would come after that, and particularly given the complexity of this war. And so the approach is largely to muddle through with the current partners that we have, try to set the conditions for stabilization, and hope that the broader array of U.S. efforts on the diplomatic side will bear fruit through a diplomatic process to create some leverage on Assad, Russia, and Iran. I think part of that equation, to connect to our meta theme today of Iranian militias, is how the region, the U.S., European allies can put pressure on Iran in the context of Syria.
We're going to get to that, I promise. I know. I promise we'll get to it.
Let me just jump in on one quick point here.
Sure.
The Kurds, again, I was ambassador in Syria from 98 to 2001. The Kurds, as a non-Arab minority, did not threaten the Assad regime, so the Assads pretty well left them alone. Their one big grievance was many of them were stateless. They didn't have Syrian documentation. But they do have that kind of unique relationship, and up until fairly recently, there were representatives from Damascus in, like, Qamishli. So it's a sure bet that, given the uncertainty of what we might do next, the Syrian Kurds are definitely talking to the regime.
And they're working with them, right? They sell oil to them. They've got,
Business
regime.
is business.
Business is business. Waz, that takes us to what Adam Kinzinger called our folks in Syria. He said we got to support our folks in Syria. Who are our folks in Syria? Do we have folks in Syria? Who should be our folks in Syria? What should we do with our folks in Syria?
Well, first of all, I want to thank FDD for giving me the opportunity to be on this great panel. It's an honor to be here, and I want to ask Congressman Kinzinger for his words, but also for the amazing work that he's done on Syria specifically. And I think, first of all, it's really sort of surreal to be sitting here and talking about Syria and talking about all the complexities of the conflict, knowing that 400,000 people in a suburb of Damascus, maybe the same distance between sort of Crystal City and here, that are being bombarded using all types of horrendous weapons by the Assad regime, Russia, and its Iranian proxies and allies and militias on the ground that are led and supported by the IRGC and the Quds Force. I think that in Syria, I've seen that there has been an opportunity to both do sort of the right thing in terms of our values as the United States, in terms of protecting civilians, putting an end to the killing, and at the same time, it happens in this situation that our values align with our national interests. It is not in our interest to have literally every Iranian militia, IRGC, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, which have been a symptom of the Assad regime's policy and its Iranian patrons and Russia's indiscriminate bombardment in these areas. The United States has worked and has vetted, and both covertly and overtly, many different groups on the ground in Syria that are the right people. I want to start off by saying our folks in Syria are the people that still carry the same value of this revolution when it began. Every time I go back to the region and I talk to someone who's internally displaced, who's lost someone, who's their loved ones were detained or killed and they're bombarded and displaced, and I ask them, why are you in the situation that you are in right now? They give me a very simple answer while understanding themselves the complexities of the conflict, that they did this because they wanted their unalienable rights, they wanted democracy, they wanted freedom. I think that our successes that we've seen in combating ISIS, and now we hold about 30% of Syrian territory with our partners of the Syrian SDF. And we have, if you're watching now what's going on in Idlib in terms of the fighting that's going on against Al-Qaeda's affiliate there, Al-Nusra, which has seen huge defeats in the past days, as a matter of fact. And those in Ghouta, by the way, that are also working to expel the 250 to 300 Nusra fighters that are there in the hopes that there would be a lull to the bombardment of civilians that's going on there. And so I can tell you that the Syrian opposition, the moderate vetted opposition that we've worked with in the past, some of them continue to be under our programs, are still there, and they need to be seen as a resource. So I think we need a strategy, first of all, where we tie and one thing that I think sort of is challenging, of course, is you have 30% of the country with our partner forces, that is SDF in the east and north, that is sort of divorced from the Geneva process, from the political process. And also, in a way, I've seen, at least in meetings between the Department of Defense and the State Department and so on, that there is a divorce in terms of who we see as our guys, right? We support the High Negotiating Committee in Geneva, and we support our military on the ground in these areas. And so it's important to bring together Sunni Arabs that respect Kurdish autonomy, the rights that have been taken away from the regime. The regime, I don't think, was kind to the Kurdish populations in Syria, while at the same time working and empowering them to counter not just ISIS, with the remnants of ISIS, but also Al-Qaeda, while at the same time putting and treating Iranian forces in Syria at the same risk level and the sort of the same level that we treat Sunni extremists. Because I could tell you what Iran is doing in terms of implications for our own national security and for the humanitarian disaster that's ongoing there is a much bigger priority even than defeating the remnants of ISIS now and what's there from Al-Qaeda.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. More specifically,
sure.
Should we keep going with the SDF? Is it really a viable organization going forward to hold and manage Sunni Arab areas? And if not, are there actual groups, you say the moderate vetted opposition, be more specific? Who are the people on the ground who we can really trust with our money, even our weapons, even our aid?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, in terms, we just concluded a study in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor for CENTCOM that focused on sort of the local populations in these areas that have been recently liberated from ISIS through U.S. coalition, air power, and SDF partners on the ground. And the goal there was to try to sort of understand and manage the expectations of civil society, community leaders there, etc. And I think it's really so. What we've learned is that it's incredibly important to show these areas that they are going to be, self-governed, that local councils, civil society, that we can allow local governance for these local populations, local councils that are Arab-led, etc. I think that's incredibly important. We should continue our work with SDF, but in a way that makes it more inclusive. The perception in Syria is that SDF is seen as YPG, PYD, etc. But PKK, exactly. But what we can do is try to make SDF what its title sort of means, right? And that is by including specifically local governance of these Arab areas. And we have many people that have fought fierce battles against ISIS early on that were then occupied by ISIS that don't want to live under ISIS. And by the way, are the biggest enemies of Iran and the Assad regime as well, which is incredibly important that with all these oil-rich areas, that we find a way to both put SDF and these local populations into the political process in Geneva, as slow and long, as that might be, so we don't end up in a situation where we do have to pull out and there is some sort of deal that allows Iran to essentially take the land, the oil in these areas and sort of empower their land bridge that they've been building inside the country.
So we took the oil. Are we going to keep the oil?
We got to keep the oil.
We got to keep the oil. Okay. Maybe President's watching. Doctor.
Yes.
Tell us what's going on inside the Trump administration's Syria policy. Understanding that FDD is a nonprofit, 501c3 nonpartisan organization, do you agree with Adam Kinzinger that the Trump administration is pushing back on Iran? Is there a gap between their rhetorical and functional approaches? What's the skinny on what's going on inside the White House?
There is some pushback, but there's also a gap. First, let me just say thank you to everyone here in the audience, both those who work on the Hill and in the press. We really appreciate you taking the time, and to my colleagues here on the panel as well. So Rex Tillerson's speech a little while back was the most developed statement on Syria that this administration has offered. And given how pressing the problem is, it came a little bit late, a year into the administration. In a way, it depended first on the Iran policy being laid out in the speech that President Trump gave last October. And really, it's natural, of course, that Syria in some ways had to be subordinate to that, because until you have your regional strategy in place, which centers on Iran. And yet, there are still a lot of ambiguities. There's a lot of members on the Hill who are pushing for what they would call a clear strategy. There was 40 members who signed a letter to the administration saying, give us more. And Tillerson sort of laid out a set of 5 objectives. He made a few comments that were significant on the how part, really just relating to stabilization. But major questions of how much of our commitment is there, what do we want to achieve, are still open. Tillerson definitely made waves by saying that preventing the areas we've liberated from ISIS from falling into the regime's hands would be an objective now. And that is a big departure, because that really was not a clear message. There were Pentagon spokesmen earlier who, when asked about it, do we care whether it is SDF or regime forces in Hezbollah who liberate territory from ISIS, the answer from the Pentagon was a blessing on anyone who liberates territory from ISIS. They're doing the same work as we are. And now we understand that's not the case. So that's a step forward. But the immediate reconstruction is not the same as articulating a vision, and especially if we have this 30% slice of Syria, which, as the panelists pointed out, is probably where 90% of the pre-war oil production took place. Some gas, not the same kind of percentage. But this is leverage. And when I went to talk to some of the NSC staff, we said, what is the leverage for getting any kind of concession from Assad, from Russia, from Iran? And it's this slice that we hold now, but we're not saying what its political future is. We're saying we want it stabilized. We don't want it to be a humanitarian disaster. Is it going to be something like one large safe zone, sort of the safe zone idea that was floated during the campaign? We haven't articulated that. We want local governance, but to just have a series of local governments is not necessarily to create anything viable and sustainable that could keep itself out of the hands of the Assad regime, especially without a firm commitment from us. I think we've seen definite signs from the Department of Defense that they don't want to be saddled with a mission that perhaps they don't have political cover for from the White House, that they have a lot of experience with these missions, gained at tremendous cost in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they also know the dangers of being in a situation where, like Afghanistan, you're still doing it. You still have 10,000 troops there. You may be sending even more. And while we're afraid of losing, neither the president nor anyone else in the country really wants to make the case for winning. So they're wary of that. And then the biggest question comes back to the president himself. What does he want? I mean, it was a tremendous surprise to everyone on every side of every aisle when he launched retaliatory strikes in response to the sarin attack on Khan Sheikhoun. So what does he want now? How does he see Syria fitting into his Iran strategy? One of my colleagues, John Hanna, has argued very forcefully that if you don't have a real Syria strategy, you don't have an Iran strategy at all. If you don't stop them there, you don't have a plan for stopping their regional aggression. And we're still waiting. That what I hear is sort of whispers, rumors to some extent. Obviously, I don't talk to the president himself of what might be happening. There's some sense that he is, he doesn't want bad things to happen for Iran to gain, but he's also very impatient, and he made it clear that his instincts are to do less and not more, and doesn't want to risk anything. So we're still seeing those dynamics play out.
Interesting. Very quick follow-up on leverage. When I talk to administration officials, they always say the same thing. They said the reconstruction money is the leverage, that we're going to hold back the money that Assad really wants to rebuild until he does A, B, and C and comes to the table. Does that hold water?
I seriously doubt that it's an effective form of leverage. I think we see how content he is to basically destroy his own country just to preserve his place. And the minimal needs that his regime has perhaps can be supplied by Iran or by Russia. And absolutely, we should block those reconstruction funds from going. There's no reason a dollar should go through the regime, because it'll benefit the regime and not the people anyhow. But we have to do more. It's about what we control there. And it's about also a renewed sanctions campaign, as well as targeting Iranian entities, IRGC entities, that make it possible.
Thank you for the segue. We're going to do a round on the advertised topics, what to do about a specific but important part of this problem, Shia militias running wild in Iraq and Syria. I want to start with Ambassador Crocker. Start with what's going on in Iraq. And we hear a lot about whether or not all these PMFs, all the militias are really under the control of the Iraqi government or not, how the politics in Iraq affect that, whether or not we can live with that as it's going, And tell us what's going on the Iraqi side of the border first, and then if you have more on Syria, of course.
So I arrived in Baghdad on a hot night in March 2007, coming directly from Islamabad. And getting off that helicopter, I had this eerie sense that I had stepped back a quarter of a century to Lebanon and Beirut. I was in Lebanon for the birth of Hezbollah, or the organization that became Hezbollah. The Syrians and the Iranians handled that beautifully. We in Israel paid a huge price in Lebanon for the unintended consequences of Peace for Galilee. It got rid of the PLO, who could argue with that, and it gave us Hezbollah, from which we all still suffer. So it was a winning formula there, and it's just what they were doing in Iraq. With the Shia militias in the center and the south, and Al-Qaeda moving easily through Syria into the west. You know the rest of that story. It was in great shape when I left in 2009, and then it went to hell. It was all their fault. The going was good when I was there. So what you're seeing now, again, is the, phase 2 or phase 3 of the Iranian strategy. Why settle for one Hezbollah when you can have, how many have we got, Melissa?
I think in the region, it's about 250,000 expeditionary forces at Iran's disposal.
So here's the one point I would like to register. The importance of understanding what your adversary is doing and why. You take a look at someone like Qasem Soleimani, and I hope folks interested in him have read the New Yorker piece by Dexter Filkins, The Shadow Commander. Best thing I've seen in English on Soleimani. Who is Qasem Soleimani? Qasem Soleimani commissioned in the Iranian army the summer of 1980. About 6 weeks later, Iraq invaded Iran. Soleimani was an infantry officer, went through all 8 years of that war, as far as we can tell, 7 of them on the Iraqi front, including the Fau front, which was kind of like the Battle of the Somme, over and over and over again. At one point, in the late 80s, he was an acting division commander for a short period because everybody above him was dead. It would be like a British subaltern going through 1914 to 1918 twice, 8 years. So what do you think Qasem Soleimani thinks about when he thinks about Iraq? Never again. That no matter who rules in Baghdad, never again will Iraq threaten Iran's existence. That means you do the projection of power through militias. You will ensure, as long as those keep going, you're never going to have a stable government in Baghdad. So Iranian interests are directly counter to ours. And this bit about we have a common enemy in Al-Qaeda, let us work together. Oh, God. We absolutely do not. And having given Soleimani free rein, I mean, the guy's holding press conferences in Tikrit. How do we reel that back in? Well, it's pretty hard to regain ground that you gave up because you didn't think it was important anymore.
But we've got to try. Melissa, you have all of the details about how to do that. For this audience of congressional officials who have the power and the mandate to legislate, what can they do? What should they do? What are the options?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to tackle that, but I think also just providing a little bit more context on the proxies, because I think it's formidable, but also worth unpacking a little bit of the nuance. if I may. I mean, proxies have been historically part of Iran's toolkit since the 79 revolution. Iran knows quite well that its conventional military inferiority places it at a disadvantage in the region. And so it has relied upon asymmetric tactics and coercive and shaping tools like its proxy network, first and foremost, in order to achieve its objectives, alongside its missile development, its provocative maritime activities, exploiting cyber vulnerabilities, and employing information operations. But the proxies have been really core to this strategy. And in using these asymmetric tactics, Iran ensures that any escalations against the United States and its regional partners fall short of large-scale warfare, and that's where it likes to operate. And through this approach, Iran can pursue its goals while avoiding kinetic consequences, enjoy plausible deniability by using its proxies, subvert regional rivals and deter them from taking actions that could trigger a potential backlash from the proxy groups, and infiltrate and influence state institutions incrementally in countries with weak governance. Again, that common word that we're seeing coming up. Moreover, the wars in Iraq and in Syria, as we've been discussing, have provided fertile ground for the growth of Iranian proxies and supported groups. And they also have broader implications. As Russia has reemerged as a regional player following the Syrian intervention, it's allied with Iran, raising the geopolitical stakes for the United States in Syria. Israel may be taking greater unilateral and proactive steps in Syria to protect its security and subvert militia presence, as we have seen in recent years. But Iran's approach also presents some vulnerabilities that lead us then to think about what actions we might take, that through its destabilizing regional activities, Iran's image as an international pariah remains in many ways the same, impairing its economic development, which is core to its ambitions in the region and on the global stage. And Iran is also hindered by a principal agent problem when it comes to its proxies. Not all proxies are created equal. Some have more ideological coherence with the Iranian regime than others, and that presents opportunities potentially for the United States and its regional partners to pry some groups apart. Yet the United States and its regional partners to this point have largely been unable to deter Iran's incremental extension of regional power, including using its proxy network. Indeed, I would contend that in the last 6 years, Iran's threat network has grown. The costs of its manpower losses and early domestic pressure against the Syrian war intervention are now outweighed by Iran's upper hand in Assad's consolidation of authority in western and central Syria and the prospects for reconstruction. Per General Votel's testimony yesterday, Iran exerts influence and degree of control over the majority of nearly 100,000 Shia militias within the Iraqi PMF. And following the Mosul offensive, much like in Syria, it'll be interesting to watch what role these militias might take going forward, both through military and political channels to exploit some of the challenges there. It's also worth tracking the notable evolutions in Iran's use of force, as it has grown in expeditionary capability, leveraging foreign fighters in its Shia militias in Syria, and also using a blend of both unconventional and conventional Iranian forces in Syria, the conventional forces not having been deployed since the Iran-Iraq War. And what this portends going forward for the Iranian projection of its force employment. And when it relates to the expeditionary capability, the Iranians have shown some adeptness in being able to move its Iraqi, Afghan, and Pakistani militias in and out of the Syrian theater to respond to other requirements. There's been some recent movements, for example, to Afghanistan, to Yemen, as the pace of operations have changed across the theater. The IRGC and some of its conventional army have rotated its cadre of brigade-level officers to Syria to train and lead operations, increasing their proficiency potentially for future operations. And Iran is turning its proxy network, its axis of resistance, into a region-wide resistance army. As noted earlier, approximately over 250,000 personnel are now responsive to IRGC command throughout the region, including but not just in Syria and Iraq. Damascus and Baghdad may be able to demobilize some of the less proficient militias with domestic ties going forward, but they'll still maintain some latent deterrent capability with these forces at their disposal, while probably keeping some of the more highly proficient groups with closer ideological commitment to Iran as a critical feature of the Iraqi and Syria landscape. Just very briefly, in some ideas of how to tackle this going forward. I might just offer a point that may not be that might be somewhat controversial in today's political environment, and that is that policymakers face a dilemma when it comes to Iran. That if Iran's hostile actions elicit a conciliatory response, Iran can deem that its actions are successful, that its coercive and shaping strategy is working. But if Iran's hostile actions elicit a punitive response, Iran can feel even greater incentive to act asymmetrically where its strengths are. So I believe that leads us to an approach that includes a sequence combination of both pressure and inducements. That, again, is going to be politically difficult in the current environment, but I think historically has proven out to be perhaps more successful with an actor like Iran. I'm going to pause there.
Carrots and sticks. Got it. Well, Moaz, let's talk about the sticks. We've got the Caesar bill. It punishes Assad regime, Iran, Russia. The House has passed it twice. What's going on? Who's holding it up in the Senate? Let's name them and shame them.
Well, first of all, yes, in the Senate, the House has passed twice the Caesar Civilian Protection Act, and bipartisan, overwhelmingly, over 100 co-sponsors, and it has been sitting in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a very long time. So I call on Senator Corker to please move this bill. This bill is up to date. It is, by the way, don't underestimate even the symbolic value of getting something like this through. I mean, will be the only clean bill legislation passed on Syria in the last 7 years of war, and the Syrian people, Caesar himself, the many brave individuals that have documented the crimes of the regime, that have identified the heads of the intelligence branches torturing people to death on a daily basis as we sit here today, would see this as a deterrent, and it would also provide a little bit of a glimmer of hope for those in Syria that have found themselves alone. But beyond that, I would start off by saying we cannot, and this is my personal opinion, we cannot rely on Russia to get Iran out of Syria, and I think that is a mistake. It's very important, I think, to note that. But beyond that, the very first step that anyone can take is designating some of these Iranian-backed militias on the ground in Syria as terrorist organizations. They have done things as horrific as other terrorist organizations, and have explicitly threatened us, threatened our partners, our allies in the region. So I would commend Chairman Ted Poe, who introduced H.R. 2438, the Iranian Proxies Terrorist Sanctions Act, which would sanction some of the biggest militias, Fatimiyun, Zainabiyun, Asa'ib al-Haq, Abu Fadl al-Abbas, that are in Syria operating. And I want to commend FDD for being able to analyze and put together a really powerful list of some of these horrible militias that are operating there and costing the biggest amount of deaths. I want to say, look, the Iran debate in the U.S. is always sort of revolving around the Iran deal. I'm not here to discuss the merits of it, but if it's good or bad, but I can tell you the biggest losers of that deal were the Syrian people. And Syrian civilians have been the biggest, by amount of people that have been killed by Iran and its militias in there. There's also H.R. 4012, the National Intelligence Estimate on Iranian Proxies Forces Act, supported by Brad Schneider, Congressman Schneider. I think that's another important step going forward, but that's not enough. Sanctioning and designating these militias as terrorist organizations is the first step, but it's incredibly important to work with already vetted opposition groups and people on the ground that are pushing back against both Sunni extremists and the Iranians on the ground. And I think we should keep that as an option. And finally, I want to reiterate what General Mattis had said before. The goal of transitioning away from the Assad regime, the fall of this horrendous regime that has been horrible for the entire region. He said in 2012, testifying before the Senate, that it would be the biggest blow to Iran in 30 years. Iraq is a difficult situation in terms of slowing down Iranian influence there and control, but Syria should not belong to the Iranians, and we should not be honoring the blood of these terrorist organizations that has been spilled in Syria, killing the Syrian people and Syrian children, and including them in any sort of transitional negotiating process going forward. I have a lot more to say, but I will end there.
We'll leave that for the Q&A. Thank you, David. Put a bow on this for us. You know, do we have the will, the capacity, the intention to deal with this militia problem? And if so, you know, what can we do?
Sure. It's an open question. One of the biggest tests will be what we do about the proposed Boeing sale to a number of Iranian companies. Companies like Mahan Air and Iran Air, they're a critical part of the air bridge. They take these militias from Afghanistan or from their training sites in Iran and other places into Syria. It doesn't have to be that way. And it's interesting how we know these things. Militiamen like taking selfies as much as the rest of us, and they post them online. So you don't need U.S. intelligence assets to know that this is a fact, although those reinforce it. And so why is it that 15 months, almost 15 months into this administration, we're still asking, oh, should we block this Boeing sale, should we not? In the JCPOA, it says that there was a carve-out allowing sales of commercial aircraft to these Iranian entities on the condition that they are not engaged in these kind of activities in Syria, that they have to be exclusively for commercial use. We know that's absolutely not the case. I think there's concern about killing a multi-billion-dollar deal for a major American manufacturer. FDD has done work to show that, in fact, some of these, it won't create as many jobs in the U.S. as it might actually create in China, where some of the planes would be built. So this is an absolutely crucial test in our view. We've also done a lot of work just showing how much we know about this route of transfer. The sanctioning will also be a test. I agree that it's a first step at best, but a lot of the time this government can't get itself together and act until it names the problem according to its formal naming system. We want to go after these groups' assets if possible, right? We did damage to Iran not just by designating, by having real means of making the economic pain felt. And I think we'll still have a lot to learn about whether the militias have these kind of assets. But some of them, like Hezbollah, are a little different. The original Lebanese Hezbollah, State Department estimates they have 7,000 fighters on the ground at any time in Syria. They've taken, we know from funerals, there's at least 1,200 who have died in battle, possibly more. And there's been recent legislation moved to tighten the screws on Hezbollah. A lot more needs to be done in the Western Hemisphere. Obviously, Josh Meyer's expose in Politico, raise that issue to the top, leaving aside any controversy about the article itself. I think it's unquestionable there's a lot more to do and a lot tougher we can get. So those are going to be the tests. It's not so much a question of what are the practical steps. It's the question is, are we going to overcome hesitations either to block a major sale or to take a new set of actions we weren't already committed to?
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to throw it open for questions at this point. A couple of quick reminders. If you could identify yourself with your name and your organization, put your comments in the form of a question, please, and please be aware that this is being live streamed, so even your questions are on the record. Show of hands. Sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Qasim Eid. I'm actually a Syrian survivor of Assad war crimes and chemical weapons and starvation in Syria. And my question is very simple. How long should we wait? How many people should die until we can convince the current administration that they should do more in Syria? The Obama administration already failed Syria. More than 700,000 people got killed, 12 million people got displaced, and thousands of children got gassed and starved to death. What is America waiting for? Thank you.
Ambassador?
I can't tell you how great it is to no longer be in government. And I have genuine sympathy for my compatriots who are in government, regardless of which administration. This stuff is really, really hard. So as you have probably gathered by now, listening to us drone on for an hour, we can say that the Trump administration does not have a Syrian policy. They really don't. But you didn't hear a lot of brilliant thinking from any of us as to what that might be that would actually start saving Syrian lives. I can tell you one thing I think it isn't. This fixation on chemical weapons. Because tacitly, what we are saying to them is, kill all of your own people you want, just don't use chemical weapons. To make this about the weapon rather than about the murder of innocent civilians, I think is abhorrent. That neither administration intended that, but that's the message. If you barrel bomb your population, we're not going to come after you. But if you use gas, we may. So that is, once you're in a really deep hole, just stop digging, and that would be my recommendation there. I don't know if we can do anything on security zones, safe zones, no-fly zones. Those of you in the military would understand this better than I. My military friends told me some time ago that you could have effectively no-fly zones north and south without ever having to put manned aircraft over Syrian territory. It can be done by partly by our guided missile ships out in the Med, partly from platforms over Turkey or over Jordan. I think that should be revisited. And again, yeah, we don't want to start World War III with the Russians, but pretty simple to say something like, we see civilian targets bombed, we're going to go after a Syrian military target. Doesn't matter who does the bombing, Russia, Syria, we're going to hit a Syrian military target. So these are some of the things that I would like to see us play with there. And I just want to add one other caution. This is unbelievably complicated. And when I look at what happened with the Iranian drone, the loss of your aircraft, I was a little tense there, shall we say. It didn't, I think, go any farther, at least at that time, because none of the principal protagonists, in my view, really want an all-out war. None of the principal protagonists wanted World War I either. And you're looking at a situation that is so incredibly complex with so many actors on the field. The possibility of something blowing sky high that no one really intended, I think, is great.
I know, Moaz, you want to answer this, but let me add something, because I think often we come back to, the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress is a reflection of the U.S. people. And, something I've always wondered for the last 7 years is, why don't the American people care more about what's going on in Syria, since you know a lot of American people.
I do.
Add that to your answer about whatever it was you were going to
say. So, I was born in Damascus, and I moved to the United States. I was about 11 years old, and I moved to Arkansas. And Arkansas now has a women's center, supports a theater troupe, a school for orphans inside Syria. All it took were people that very far away from even Washington and the politics or what's going on in the world, that learned about what was happening to children and stood by them. And it is truly, truly inspirational. And so I think you're right. I think when the American people are aware of what's happening, they instinctively know what the right thing to do is and call on the protection of these civilians. Qasim reminded me of something that's really important. First of all, this young man is a hero on his own. He survived the sarin attack that happened in August in Ghouta, the starvation campaigns there, and miraculously escaped and was able to come here. And I remember his meetings, the Bass administration, on very senior levels, and he's back here today trying to call for an end of the killing there. Also reminds me of the place that he's from, and it reminds me of a very important issue that Iran has strategically worked on that has been incredibly underreported, which is the demographic shifts that are happening inside of Syria. We're talking about entire populations. For us, looking at the news from far away, it seems that it's just arbitrary displacement of rebelling populations into areas like Idlib and Daraa, where they will be bombed later, or displaced into Europe or and elsewhere. But these areas are now the homes of the families of these terrorist militias that have come. There was an incident, for example, in Damascus where Iranian businessmen wanted to buy a market, and when the Sunni merchants refused to do so, that whole market was burned down. Ghouta isn't just wanting to kill all of the civilians there, is what's going on right now, but it's also to displace Sunni populations and to create for Iran a place where they have patrons there that doesn't matter if they want them to become Shia, not for ideologically, but also just to understand that the order comes from Tehran. And this demographic shift that is happening inside Syria is incredibly dangerous, and it should be pointed out more, and Congress should address it, and so should the administration. And that's one thing that has happened into Qasim's home, and he's a witness himself into who now sits and lives in his home that are alien to the country.
Is it ethnic cleansing?
I spoke to Ambassador Stephen Rabb, the former U.S. War Crimes Ambassador, about this, and Dr. Steve Heidemann, who used to be the Vice President of the USIP, now teaches at Smith, and discussed this. And you know, they gave me, and we were working on sort of the, you know, what are legally in international law, like what would be sort of the measures for something to be qualified as war crimes and ethnic cleansing. Absolutely it is. There are, in Idlib today, Damascus, Aleppo, residents of all of these different areas of Syria, homes that are living there that were shipped off on those green buses and now being bombarded regularly. That school supported by Arkansans was bombed by the Russians in the Assad regime. All these children had to be evacuated. It was Arkansans that got a bus for them to help them escape, and then now help repatriate them when there's been a lull in the bombardment for only a week. That's how desperate people are ready to go back home, even if they have to rebuild from scratch. And I would say one line in terms of what we can do. At the very least, we should ground Assad's Air Force. I know this sounds maybe drastic. It's not. 20% of the Air Force was destroyed when we responded, according to General Mattis. We can check on that. But Israel also destroyed half of its air defenses in retaliation for bringing down the Israeli airplane. And as Ambassador Crocker said, we don't have to get into a third world war. I'm not saying go after the Russians, etc., or anything like that. But there should be payment. There should be consequence for the killing of civilians that is happening, whether that is by chemical weapons, chlorine, or by conventional weapons.
Washington Post.
Hi. Missy Ryan from the Washington Post. Happy to be here today. Thanks for the panel. And thanks to my colleague Josh for moderating. I have a question for anyone on the panel. Is it possible to get Iran out of Syria or minimize its presence and active influence without ending the conflict, without having a negotiated end to the conflict? Is there a way to do that short of the political goal that seems so elusive?
Who wants to take that one? Melissa? Oh,
go ahead.
No,
I would say categorically no. Again, it's worth looking back in time. The Shah was a big proponent of projecting Iranian power beyond Iranian borders. It was the Shah's navy that seized the 3 islands from the United Arab Emirates. It was the Shah's army that deployed the equivalent of a mechanized infantry brigade into the Arabian Peninsula at the request of the Sultan of Oman to put down a rebellion in Dhofar. The Islamic Republic is doing the same thing, except with unconventional forces rather than conventional. So again, whether it's monarchs or mullahs ruling in Tehran, Iran's geostrategic sense of itself is very deeply rooted. So this for them is a critical part of their national security logic and infrastructure. They are not going to be negotiated out of this, and if someone has a good plan for pushing them out, I will shake your hand and wish you Godspeed, and I won't stand anywhere near you so I don't get caught with the collateral backlash.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question. USA Today.
Paul Schenkman, U.S. News and World Report.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right, Josh.
I'm sorry. U.S. News and World Report.
Washington Times is always for mistakes. I'd be interested to ask you about what you think, when you look at the situation in Syria, what you think Russia has gained from its involvement there, either information about how it deploys its military, and then when you look at sort of the after effect of what might happen, how much influence do you think that Russia has over any of its so-called allies there to influence them for how they behave in the future? Thanks.
David, you want to take credit for that?
Sure. I think Russia's gained quite a bit. I mean, part of it is the intangible of being a power broker and an arbiter of Middle Eastern conflicts, that they, suffered some severe blows to their regional position during the later years of the Cold War, especially when Egypt flipped to become more of an American partner. and then they were sort of allowed back in. Obviously, part of it is just about the material advantages of the bases they're building, which they could probably maintain in perpetuity. They have a decades-long relationship with the Assad family, so to see him go would be to lose a major asset. Part of it is, of course, to just cause trouble to the United States, that they can make things more difficult for us, they can embarrass us. And part of it is a partnership with Iran, that they have interests in common. There's an ongoing debate about whether it's possible to divide them. You know, there's some would argue, I've heard this from European diplomats, that ultimately what they want is they need the legitimacy to ratify their presence in Syria, and that would come with them ultimately agreeing to some kind of transition. I personally don't agree to that. I think they know that it's the people with the guns who are in the money who are in charge, and they're much happier to partner with Iran, which exerts so much control. The second half of your question, I think I didn't hit it exactly.
How much influence does Russia have over its allies there?
So I think its air power is essential. So I think that there's a pretty solid consensus that the regime was at a very severe risk of falling apart until the Russians intervened in September 2015. And they continued to provide a lot of that air power. Even if we take out Syria's own air force, Russia will continue to have that advantage. I don't think they can really alter Iranian objectives or Syrian objectives. They're doing things to cultivate their own proxies within Syria. They're also using economic power to the extent they can. So they have advantages to the extent they're willing to use pressure. Obviously, they hung back and let the Israelis take out a lot of Iranian and Syrian assets, although we don't know. Perhaps they would block the Israelis next time, and it seemed that they reined in Netanyahu, if some of the reports can be believed. So they're an integral part of the coalition. The regime might have fallen without them.
And let me quickly follow up on that. Do our panelists believe that Russia is complicit or guilty of war crimes in Syria, considering their integration with the...
Absolutely. Beyond. It's unbelievable. Yeah, Russia is committed many and continues to commit today, as we sit here, war crimes in Syria. By the way, in terms of the political transition, another thing just to keep in mind, if we allow Assad to continue to believe, and he pretty much has a military victory, Geneva is just a random distraction that we can point to say that there's something political in terms of transition going on out of there. And as David said before, we do have leverage in terms of the 30% of the country. That's why it's incredibly important to push for a political transition into a democratic country and to bring together Arabs and Kurds to allow local governance in Syria has become very localized in terms of communities governing themselves in at least pseudo-democratic ways, and we've seen them push back against Iranian militias. One thing I'm reminded of is I think Mr. Pollack in AAI had mentioned that our best partners on the ground are the vegetarian opposition, which, again, as I mentioned earlier, have made huge strides in pushing back al-Qaeda, for example, in the north. We need to utilize them to push back against Iranian aggression there. And as Ambassador Crocker said, if we were to hit regime positions every time they killed civilians, these are the only things that may give the regime a second thought at sitting down and maybe negotiating anything other than a military victory, which he believes he has.
Just very briefly, if we truly want to be able to translate the economic potential leverage in eastern Syria into something that's concrete, that requires strengthening the diplomatic and development, in particular, tools of the United States at a time when this administration is deprioritizing, from a resourcing perspective, those elements of national power. So in terms of something that Congress can do, that would be to advocate and resource those particular elements of statecraft.
Yeah, I should note here that there is reporting, and I can confirm that the administration is looking for a new, very high-level senior envoy to deal with Syria diplomacy.
In terms of the USAID program that will be needed to reinforce agriculture and the oil sector in eastern Syria, those are resources that are under constraint at the moment.
Yes, and those resources are being cut according to the budget. But let me ask Ambassador Crocker. So we've got Geneva. We've got Astana, we've got Sochi. Are any of these really viable? If you were, leading the diplomatic part of this, which one would you focus on? As a famous diplomat, how do we navigate that mess?
Well, that's the operative word. To me, it's shameful. It's humiliating that we have been allowed to sit in on the Astana meetings as an observer. That's not the United States of America. Look, we should step into this diplomatically. We should put our weight behind de Mistura and the Geneva process. Not likely to go anywhere anytime soon, but you want it there. You want it visible. You want to think broadly with de Mistura about things it might be able to do, like talking about agricultural policies. Whoever winds up ruling in Damascus is going to have to figure out how to put the agricultural sector back together. The collapse of agriculture in Syria was a major contribution to this fight. So to look at some concrete things that everybody could agree need to be addressed somehow, that's the way I would go. But here's the problem. Here's what frames everything we've been saying here. What is the role of the United States in the world in 2018 and going forward? Just very briefly here, I know I'm going to drag it back to World War I again. We did not play a part in that process, so you wound up with a 2-decade truce in one long world war. After World War II, we envisioned the new international order, and we led it. The San Francisco Conference for the United Nations, Bretton Woods for the international financial system. The U.S. was leading the world. What happened? Well, you know, we got through 70 years without a major land war in Europe. That's not too bad. But with the election of President Obama, we started backing away. Never formally said, but if you look at the Atlantic article, it pops up a number of times. We can't fix everything. That became an excuse for not trying to fix much of anything. The Trump administration seems to be following the same path. So are we going to lead in the world? Or are we going to step back and let the world look out for itself? If it's going to be the latter, we should have some very serious public discussions about that. My fear is not that China will step in and assume our leadership mantle. It's that they can't. No one else can. Clinton in Bosnia, he said rightly, this is a European problem, let the Europeans fix it. Well, that did not work. So you got the Dayton Accords. That would be Dayton, Ohio, not Dayton, France.
Thank you. Anybody from congressional staff have a question? Anybody at all? All right, well, sir.
Carlo Munoz with the Washington Times. 2 quick questions, and apologies if you covered this earlier. One, I wanted to get the panel's thoughts on General Votel's comments that Yemen, not Syria, is actually where a lot of the proxy forces are making the most progress. I think you believe that Yemen will be in 5 years what Lebanon took 20 to achieve. And secondly, in Iraq, it seems the PMUs have sort of established themselves into a political kind of coalition in preparation for the upcoming elections. How do you think that's going to play out? Will this legitimize the groups even more, or will this sort of kind of upend the sort of status quo that's in Iraq right now? Thanks.
Who wants to take Yemen? David?
Sure. I have some skepticism about whether Yemen will move that quickly to be as much of a playing field as Syria for these militias, right? So first, I should recognize my colleague Amir Tumaj sitting in the front row, who did tremendous work contributing to our joint publication and the cards you have in your folder. And to the best we can estimate, there may be something like 18 to 25,000 militia, including Hezbollah and the Fatemi and the Afghan Shiites are the biggest contributors. You don't really have exactly the same kind of proxy in Yemen. You have the Houthis, the Ansar Allah movement, but they're not really directly controlled in the same way. In Syria, they're really fighting under Qasem Soleimani and the IRGC Quds Force command and control. It's his campaign. Much more independent, and also they face some important setbacks. As you know, President Saleh, or former President Saleh, was killed in Yemen. That broke apart some of the rebel coalition. There's been some movement on the ground then, and I don't know if we'll see a resolution, but I think the problem is far more intractable in Syria. It will grow. There's definitely signs that both Lebanese Hezbollah and Kataib Hezbollah, one of the militias who has a card in your folder, are active there. It's definitely an indication of this overall Iranian strategy that every time a new front emerges, they have more groups that are capable of deploying to that new front. Also, briefly on the Fath al-Mubin electoral coalition, or Manifest Victory, that was really, Badr is the key player there, and there's about a dozen other groups. You can find them all listed on our website. So Badr has always been the heavy player. They got 22 seats in the last election, hold 21 at the moment. The thing that really gives those groups legitimacy is just how much the Shiite majority in Iraq looks to them and admires them for their role in fighting ISIS. I think, unlike American observers who probably have a lot of reservations about the atrocities they committed in that process, the inefficiency and the incompetence they sometimes displayed, in a lot of ways they're heralded as heroes at home. So that's where a lot of their legitimacy comes from. And so if they, have a surprising success in terms of the numbers of seats they take, that will definitely enhance their legitimacy. It'll ratify what they've gained. On the other hand, it's not entirely clear if they can perform better than they did in the previous elections.
And our final question goes to Sylvie.
Sylvie Lantôme from AFP. Ambassador Crocker said that nobody wants to start the Third World War with Russia. But to go back to this attack in the Euphrates River by Russian mercenaries, are you sure it was mercenaries, Russian mercenaries? And second, do you think it could happen again? Because do you think Russia is going to try again to gain more control in this region?
And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to either address that question or give some quick closing remarks, and we'll again start with Ambassador Crocker.
Well, yeah, thanks. If those were regular Russian troops, we don't have a thing to worry about anymore. We can just march on Moscow. No, it's pretty clear they were mercenaries. Were they directed by the Russian government? Who knows? This is a place where anything can happen and will happen. And again, boy, if you had lost your pilots in that shoot down, God knows where we would be now. I mean, it's one of those things where one really bad move and God knows what comes next. So this isn't Tinker Toys. I would say, given this audience, to go back to the initiative of Representative Poe, if we're going to designate, let's be strategic about it. Let's talk to the Prime Minister and others in Iraq. Who do they think they might be able to peel off from who else? So I don't know what the answers are, but I think there are some suppositions out there. We could figure it out, so that you target some of these militias, but not all, and see if you can start pulling them apart a bit. We did that during the surge in Iraq with some of the Anbar tribes, where we would say, "Why don't you come on over to the side of right, truth, and justice?" Because Abu Muhammad, with his branch of the Huwaita, did just that. And the guy would say, "That son of a bitch, I'm going to kill him." And, sometimes that happened, and that was good. Of course, Abu Muhammad did nothing of the sort. We didn't even know him. But you can kind of get in there and mess with their minds a bit. So I don't think just a wholesale designation is a good idea. Let's start being smart about this stuff.
Thank you. Melissa?
Great. Just to build off of that, I mean, I think it's pretty clear in the last couple of weeks the risks of escalation are growing in Syria, whether it's the incident that you mentioned with the U.S. and the Russians, Israel and Iran, Turkey and the Kurds and the SDF, with Assad of the United States in play. On multiple fronts in this war, the risks of escalation are growing more and more profound, and it raises the imperative for the United States to provide some connective tissue between the goals that were set out in Secretary Tillerson's speech and the bottom-up approach that it is taking in eastern Syria. In the absence of that clarity, I worry about our personnel that are in harm's way, but also the cascading effects in the region that have proven to be escalatory over the last 7 years in ways that I don't think anyone could have anticipated in 2011. And the narrow approach that the United States has taken to this conflict over the last 7 years is not tenable, clearly. There's the humanitarian imperative to address, there's competition with both Russia and Iran, and there's the security of our allies and partners in the region. And I think in addition to this strategy of trying to parse and pick apart tensions between Iran and its proxies and affiliates in the region, part of the answer is also building the resiliency of our local partners, but also our regional partners surrounding Syria, both in a governance and a security sense.
Thank you.
I want to say that I think the war continues to get worse and worse, and it is at a crossroads today. I think that Iran and its militias, the IRGC, that have having a foothold in Syria is the most detrimental thing to our national security. They have threatened our NATO ally, Turkey, Jordan, Israel, Iraq, which we've worked so hard to stabilize, have all been threatened openly by the Iranians and their proxies inside of Syria. And I think that for the very same reasons that we went after ISIS inside Syria, these should be the same reasons that we go after Iran in the country. I think the risk of de-escalation on Iran's terms and Russia's terms is greater than a risk of escalation to try to stop a foothold for the Iranians in the country. And beyond that, I want to ask all of you individually, anyone that's covering this from the media, to please do not forget these children that are even using YouTube, Twitter, anything to scream out at the world and say, please put an end to our killing, facilitated in operations rooms ran by the Iranian militias, IRGC in the country. Please continue to show them solidarity. Speak out. Tell your friends, your churches, your mosques, your synagogues in the media. Don't forget them. It shouldn't be news wallpaper that a never again moment is unfolding today in Syria as we all sit here. Thank you very much.
So Iran's genocidal threats against Israel are something of old news. They're often taken with a grain of salt, but the growing Iranian presence in Syria is a means for realizing that, not necessarily with a nuclear bomb, but with the tens and hundreds of thousands of rockets being given to Hezbollah, with increased precision, increased firepower. We haven't talked a lot about the south of Syria much at all, with the de-escalation zone the U.S. has negotiated with Russia. I believe it's ineffective. I believe that there are ways that it's still becoming under the control of the regime and its partners, and that is a recipe for a major war. For the moment, Hezbollah may be tied up to a certain extent, Iran may be tied up to a certain extent, but if we see the Syrian civil war end, it simply means we've come closer to the threat of a major regional war where Israel probably has to launch an extremely rapid assault to take out much larger forces. The militia we're talking about, they all make it very clear in their public statements. They want to fight Israel. It's almost their dream is fighting Israel. We'll see how they figure in tactically. I don't know that answer yet, but this is an escalation that has been 10 years in the making since the first war with Hezbollah. It's an extreme danger and no one should dismiss it.
Well, I don't think I could sum it up better than Ambassador Crocker did when he said, quote, let's get in there and mess with their minds a bit. All right? You've all been given a bunch of ideas about how the United States and the United States Congress specifically can get in there and do something active on Syria. Go forth. Make it happen. If you do make it happen, email me and let me know, josh.rogan@washpost.com. And let's give our panelists a round of applause.
Very well done.